Thank you. Um, I'll be speaking on Bali Jatra um, um, as an invented tradition. Today it's a grand spectacle of state, and in this festival, which is being held on the full moon of Kartik, November, there are several convergences of past practices, religious traditions, academic and non-academic writing, which went on to develop or lead to this invented traditions. When I'm thankful to KCHR, Dr. Manu Devadaban, who invited me to speak. When he told me to make a presentation or write something, I thought, what would I write? Because I am an ancient historian, also work on archaeology. And then I thought I'll write because I belong to Cuttack. Immediately, Eric Hobsbawm's book came to my mind. I thought I'll probe Bali Jatra because today this is being touted or this is being represented as commemorations of our Odisha's maritime past. It's a commemorative practice, a commemorative festival that commemorates voyages of ancient traders of Odisha who were called Sadhavas to Bali. This was the starting point. I thought I'll go through the vernacular print traditions of Odisha, which emerged immediately after 1866 Great Famine, and we have the first print nationalist magazine which came up in 1866, which is called Kalady. From 1866 onwards, I do up to 1920, various kind of nationalist newspaper, literary magazines, which looked at Bali Jatra, and whether they also referred to Bali Jatra as a commemorative fair that remembers the old maritime traditions of Odisha. Therefore, the genre of writing was nationalistic writing, and although they have used past as a material resource in various ways, monument figured seen, for example, Konark, Baravati Fort, by nationalist leader in order to arouse national consciousness. I will deal with why this national consciousness appears in the late 19th century briefly, the colonial characterizations of region, and but there is no reference to Bali Jatra as a representation of the maritime prowess, so-called, of ancient colonials. Even though there are novels which establish new dialogical forms where meaning, language are converged. For example, in 1926, Gopinath Mahanti, one of the first to get Ganfita from Odisha, his elder brother Kanhu Mahanti, who is also known for various novels such as Sastika, Harna, centered around Great Famine. He started writing a novel in 1926, in 1931, that was published called Bali Raja, King of Bali, and incidentally, a sadhav or a merchant from Odisha, by the quirk of fate, reached Bali and become the king and civilized the so-called uncivilized people. I look at the Greater Indian Society, which was patroned, or whose spiritual mentor was Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote the foreword of the first issue of the Journal of Greater Indian Society. That's the case today. Everybody recognizes that Bali Jatra is a festival which commemorates the maritime traditions of Odisha. But as I looked at the paint culture, there is no reference to it in the vernacular nationalist newspaper, literary magazines. The second aspect, which is very important, at what point this discourse or this narrative began to emerge. And I found that the first, it came up in 1940 in the Proceeding of Indian History Congress. Even though there are earlier writing like Virupaksha Karas writing on maritime traditions of Odisha, for the first time association of Bali Jatra, which is being held every year at Cuttack on the full moon day of Kartik Purnima, November, which Kartik Purnima is very significant for various regions, which I will also deal in, and because these kind of convergences of festivals, rituals, and also the namesake of the Bali Jatra, which is held on the sandy bank of river Mahanadi in Cuttack, that allows the academic historians to suggest that Bali Jatra is a commemoration of maritime traditions. Today, everybody recognizes Bali Jatra as a cultural festival that commemorates voyages to Bali. But as I told you, this is an invented tradition. As an invented tradition, Bali Jatra is held on full moon of the month of Kartika in commemoration of the day when ancient Sadhavas set sail to distant lands of Bali, as well as Java, Sumatra, known as Suvarnabhumi. As a state-sponsored festival today, it is held today with pomp and glamour, circulating the idea of spiritual internationalism of India in the past and spiritual colonization of Southeast Asia, which was refined in the writing of Rabindranath Tagore's Forward to Greater India Society Journal. This discourse suits more today to ideology and program of the nation state. Prime Minister Narendra Modi recollects this tradition of maritime voyage to Bali in his speech at Bali during G20 summit in 2020, and the quotation is this: about 1500 kilometers away from Bali, there is a festival of Bali Jatra being celebrated on the bank of river Mahanadi. This festival celebrates and obviously reiterates the invented traditions. And this narrative suits as I told you, about the muscular nationalism of the present regime. In 2024 edition of Bali Jatra, inaugurated by Odisha Chief Minister on November 15, 2024, was marked by unprecedented global participation. For the first time, people commissioners from 14 countries, including that of ASEAN, BIMSTEC, Pacific Island nations, joined. They came in traditional vessels. This ceremonial journey not only honored Odisha's maritime history, but also served as a gesture of international goodwill. As I told you, the state tried to iterate the narrative through state spectacle year after year, which is a reminder of so-called our spiritual colonization of Southeast Asia. Even though there is a lot of unease with this term of spiritual colonizations by the Southeast Asian countries themselves, nevertheless, as a goodwill gesture, they participated in it. Now, as Eric Hobsbawm writes in one of his essays, as well as in his famous book in the invention of traditions, what makes an invented traditions, what are the characteristics? It talks about so-called some of the past practices which are repeated, some degree of continuity. It also memorializes the past. And then, what are the novel situations that warrant an invention of tradition? We need to also look at as Eric Hobsbawm. And obviously, as I've been telling you, right since independence, especially Biju Patnaik became the chief minister, there has been a turn to this festival to give state spectacles and therefore reputations is one of the major features. And in 1992, when Biju Patnaik became the chief minister for the second time, he sent a INS Ash to Bali as commemorations of the old practice of voyages. The structure of the presentation is like this. The first part, which I'll skip or I'll focus a little less, is about the context in which past was used as a resource. And since there are plenty of literature about it, I'll just look at one, two, and then move on to the second part, which is the moment of arrival, when actually Bali Jatra, as I told you, emerged as a voyage to Bali. And I'll then explain why, what kind of deployment strategies that Ghanshyam Das, who was the paper presenter in the proceeding of Indian History Congress, who was part of Historical Record Commission, who was a student of Jadunath Sarkar. The major focus would be what kind of deployment strategies that he adopted, how he used the cultural practices, the oral literature, folk song, and others which converge on the same day to make this argument about Bali Jatra being a voyage to Bali. I'm reminded of also, because Prachi Deshpande is here, I have read his her book Creative Past, which is a fabulous book. Also the Pesh Chakrabarti's book on Jadunath Sarkar. Since Ghanshyam Das was a student of Jadunath Sarkar, and Jadunath Sarkar also taught at Revensa, where I am teaching. The dichotomies between academic writing, or the tension between the academic writing, which requires subjectivity, some kind of methodologies that need to be practiced because all of them belong to positive traditions, and the pressure from nationalist discourses, nationalist aspirations. At times, these dichotomies or the boundaries actually dissolve, and in many times invented traditions emerge from academic writing and serve political purposes, and this has been happening throughout the existence of history as a cloistered discipline of universities. Therefore, one of the major arguments I've been making is that the historian played with evidence, various kind of evidence, to give academic credence to invented traditions. And third part of the essay I'll be dealing with is how I have extensively used vernacular literature, and I found no reference to Bali Jatra in those writings from Utkal Deepika, including nationalist writing in Mukura, because there is separate sections in many of these journals, newspaper which deal with history, and they used monuments and past as a vital resources. I'll use some of the poems which are published on Bali Jatra. Bali Jatra has been fairly continuously referred to and in those magazines, including poems in literary works, literary magazines. They continuously appear year after year in Utkala Deepika, but there is absolutely no reference. They refer to debates between Brahmo on the one hand and Hindu Conservative Association on the other hand, the relationship between Brahmo and the Christian missionary on the one hand, and how Brahmos played against the Hindus, but worked with the Padris of Cuttack. There are very interesting vignettes about the relationship, how this public space and large congregations during Bali Jatra was used by religious organizations. There are references to Rasgulla being sold, and the controversy whether Rasgulla originated in Cuttack or in Odisha or in Bengal, and there has been use of these literary works to prove one point or other as part of this national discourse. And then I look at why this succeeded, how there are several literary traditions, folklores, which are obviously not product of in culture but goes back to early, because I've looked at some of the manuscript sections of the Odisha State Museum, some of the manuscripts talk about maritime traditions as part of religious brother literature, like Mughal Kavyas of Bengal. They refer to Sadhavas and their voyages too, especially Singaladeepa, but also some folklores talk about Javadeepa as well. So, therefore, nations without a past are a contradictions in terms. What makes a nation in the past, what justifies one nation against the other in the past, and historians are the people who produce it. That's what Eric Hobson writes in Anthropology Today. Therefore, nation states infused order with affect. It made rather contingent territorial boundaries and national property called heritage objects worth fighting for. Monuments, museum, past become space for display of these affective objects, weaving the story of collective past. But if you look at colonial discourse about the region and the people, I have taken from Andrew Sterling's, which is the first historical account in 1822, and then moved on to 1872 in the works of Hunter, whose work Orissa, the history of an Indian province under the native and the foreign rules. And you see a certain kind of narrative being built, and it says that this region is devoid of any particular glory. They have owned no conspicuous triumph. They have written no famous epic. They have struck out no separate school of philosophy. They have elaborated no new school of system. Nothing existed in this state. And it is in this context of colonial characterizations and Bengali dominations, especially colonial characterization of people as Boeotian, effeminate, which was compounded further by Bengali dominations of power and position in government jobs and jamindari. We have situations where Odia-speaking people were fragmented into various administrative territories of British India, and on the certain context, we see the rise of Odia so-called nationalism. As I told you, was divided. There is a unionist aspiration for the amalgamations of various Odia-speaking administrative units under British India. That happened after 1866, under the influence. When the nationalist discourse emerged, they tried to construct a cohesive, homogeneous Odia nation. History, language, literature, all of Jagannath became the major axis of constructing this cohesive, homogeneous linguistic Odia nations, and print culture, obviously, like novels, drama, newspaper, played an important role. There are traditions and there are works like that of Pragati Mahapatra, Vishnu Mahapatra and others. I don't want to quote from them, but as I told you, past became a major resource. It is in this period that new genre of novels, stories, which created national reading public by invoking past glory, one of the major, as a reactions to the characterizations of region or the people as Boeotians and effeminate. We have now today Konark, which is the state emblem, which reminds us about the military prowess of Odisha under the imperial Gangas and the Gajamatis. Hopefully this is visual to you. The horse which tramples the enemy, which is part of the horse gate of Konark as the state emblem. However, after 1936, when Odisha became a separate province, there is strain and cracks which appeared in the narrative of linguistic, homogeneous cultural nations, and there are responses to it. Satyanarayana Raju, because the new territory obviously included the Telugu-speaking people of southern Odisha. There are vast number of people who are Adivasis who speak largely Dravidian and Austric languages or Austric and Dravidian languages, but there are attempts to reconstruct the Indo-Aryan root of Odia language, as well as some kind of tribal language having connections with Udra Prakrit or the Prakrits. But the structural crack in the narrative of nationalist discourse emerged between 37 to 39 when the Congress formed the ministry, and all over India as part of 1935 Act. And especially during this time, two major issues emerged. One is the issue of Jamindari abolitions or dynasty rights, as well as the issue of extending Prajamandal movement or extending support to the freedom movements in feudatory states, where Odia rulers were ruling, who were actually the main protagonist and supporter of separate unified Odia province. When the issue of democratic rights or issue of freedom movement in feudatory states came up, obviously these people turned their table and started opposing Congress ministry, and therefore the idea of homogeneous Odia identity came under severe strain and crack. It is at this moment, as I told you, Professor Ghanshyam Das postulated this theory, this new invented tradition which is about Bali Jatra. As he writes, I have extensively quoted from his writing of 1940 Lahore Congress, proceeding of Indian History Congress. He said that the local tradition is that Bali Jatra is being celebrated as commemoration of Sree Chaitanya, the famous Bengali Gaudiya saint who came to Odisha, Vaishnava saint who came to Odisha. He crossed Mahanadi at Cuttack in 1510, and as commemoration of his arrival in Cuttack, this Bali Jatra is being celebrated. And then he says that no, this cannot be true because he came in certain months and this is being celebrated in the month of November. He came in Vaishak in April, and therefore this cannot be true. And then he provocatively suggested that no, this is about a glorious episode in the history of ancient Kalingan Empire. Have the name of Bali Jatra any relation with the voyage to Bali, because you are circumspect because of the because he had to also adhere to the historical canons of objectivity. The first meaning has been proved to be unsound. Let us see whether the second meaning is appropriate. The splendid isolation theory of ancient India, I am quoting him, has been thoroughly explored, and it is now well established fact that Indians, especially the people living in Coromandel coast, colonized the islands of the Indian archipelago. And these islands were a deep debt of gratitude to civilizing and cultural influence of ancient India. The people of islands still call themselves king or descendant of Kalingas. Are we not justified in hazarding a hypothesis? That's the key word. That Bali Jatra is a commemoration of ancient Kalinga, ancient voyages of Kalinga to the island of Bali. And it was stated long before the visit of Chaitanya. It was started long before the visit of Sree Chaitanya. And then he goes on to justify why he believes that this could be the case. Adhering to the canon of historical method which demands corroboration of sources to arrive at generalizations, Professor Das cites the cultural practices of painting with chalk and rice powder, images of Sikh in the courtyard of many Odia in the coastal districts of Odisha as one of more links of our chain of evidence. This practice is called in Odia Boita Vandana, or bidding farewell to the Sikh. The cultural practice which is being practiced today also. The cultural practice, whether it can be termed as Boita Vandana, or the etymological derivative of Boita deriving from Sanskrit word Bahitra, which finds occurrence in Odia, Sanskrit, even in Malaysia in the Malayo language, will be dealt later. But whether the cultural practice is about bidding farewell to Sikh, or it is merely votive, it is about selling votive Plantain boat is another consideration. I will deal with that, and I am of the opinion that it is a religious rituals which is about sailing dhoti plantain boats as a passage to the nether world. Because the Kartik month is also famous in Odisha as a ritual for the dead people, including many widows keep fasting for 1 month in the month of Kartik. So as I told you, there are obvious references there are strong evidence of cultural and various kind of exchanges between Southeast Asia, between Sri Lanka and Odisha in several sources, including in late medieval literature. For example, Upendra Manja talks about this and also cultural practice in Lavanyapati. There are folk songs as well as I told you, historical evidence which emerged in the same period because in 1926 Greater India Society was founded. Kalidas Nag was its foundational secretary. The spiritual Purodha was Rabindranath Tagore. And in those, especially in the Hindu colonies of Far East, R.C. Majumdar and Hemant Subhasan Sarkar in cultural contact with India and Southeast Asia, strongly, even though with a few references or few evidence talks about connections of Kalingan or the ancient Odisha people being the early voyagers and colonizer of Southeast Asia. So obviously being part of the historical commissions as well as part of Indian History Congress, Ghanashyam Das, who were the first one to go and study maybe in SSUS for an MA degree in 1900 and early 20s. He was obviously knowing about the kind of narrative that was spawned in the journals of Greater Indian Society. On the other hand, as I told you, in the nationalist writing, there is absolutely no reference to Bali Jatra as a voyage to Bali. I have used some of the, there is no point of, these are my free translations. This is written over last 2 months after Dr. Manu Devadevan told me to write something on, and I wrote on Bali Jatra. So this is from Mukuram, which is a literary magazine by nationalist politician Sundar Das, and it is in the first issue. Gopavandhu Das, one of the foremost nationalist leader, wrote a poem called In the Evening of Bali Jatra on the bank of river Mahanadi, and there absolutely there is no reference to Bali Jatra and association with maritime voyage. It talks about certain kind of religious sankirtan, people are busy in dancing, religious dance, busy in playing and dancing to the noisy sound of the bell and mudangam, conch and clapping. People are maddened by the frenzied religious dance, but where is the life force in this dance? Heart doesn't tire listening to this dance and music. Who can tell what lacks in this music? River Mahanadi flows nearby from time immemorial. The court Bharavati stands silently as witness to the bravery, valor and martyrdom in the cause of nation, who lay down their life for the cause of motherland and religion. Even though this has been blown away in the tidal flow of time, like the white foam that is blown away by the current of Mahanadi. Then he says that there will be again, Bharavati is a testament not only of the bygone time, but if God willing, there will be, a new dawn. Oh God, rain down your divine nectar on its face. Let new waves rise in the river Mahanadi. Let that wave wash the face of Bharavati to make it brighten. Let everyone be inspired by a new pure religion. Let pure faith inspire in pure dance. These old religious orgies doesn't have life force. So that's what he writes. The poem offers a rich perspective on the relationship between citizen, nation, nature, traditions, and societal change. And this poem reflects a worldview where nature is seen as a constant, impartial observer of societal living. There is no point of the sociological and cultural meaning of this is quite replete in on nationalist writing. His famous Karakavita, also Dharmapada, is an epiphany of nationalism. We have, which is another invented tradition dealt in elsewhere. Utkala Deepika, as I told you, the first issue of Utkala Deepika, which referred to Bali Jatra, that is the cultural festival on the sandy bank of Mahanadi. There are two fields, and there is upper field and lower field. The first issue is 1869, but I am quoting from November 11, 1876. It talks about two possible origins. One is about the onward journey of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to Purushottam Kshetra in 1510, and the other it says that it doesn't quote the exact words of the Padma Purana, but it says that it goes back to the time of the origin of Padma Purana, clearly giving longer antiquity to this cultural festival. Then we have other poem which was published in Indradhanu on 14 December 1893. The point is that there are nationalist writing as well as new literary magazines, newspaper which constantly refer to Bali Jatra without mentioning this sailing of boats or association with voyages to Bali. These are the issues which I am skipping for the benefit of time. And then, as I told you, as part of Ghanshyam Das deployment strategy, because of the fact that Bali Jatra is being held on the sandy bank, therefore there is a language word similarities. Bali, it could be voyages to Bali, it could be also Jatra on this sand, that is Bali. But we have to look at whether Bali could be from Balu or not. Then we have, as I told you, there is also a temporal convergence because Kartik Purnima, the full moon day of Kartik Purnima, which marks the beginning of Bali Jatra, is considered also to be very auspicious and religiously important. I look at this when I talked about Bali Jatra. But there are also, as I told you, novel as a genre of new genre of nationalist writing. We have Bali Raja by Kanhu Mahanti, which I have alluded in my writing, which is about the quick fate of Sadhavas. One of the protagonists was Mania, who by the quick of fate finally reached on the shore of Bali, become the king of Bali and civilized the people of Bali. But what is more important is the kind of languages which are used to describe the indigenous people, which is almost exact echo of what we find in the introductions and early pages which I have quoted. Also, Madhavan Pallat in recent in Southeast Asia, where he wrote also one chapter published by Rockplace, also quoted extensively from the from R.C. Majumdar's colonizations of Far East, a certain kind of characterizations of Southeast Asia, which is obviously disproved together by archaeological and other evidence. But the kind of convergence in the language, the kind of echo that we find in the language is striking, and I have quoted a passage from Bali Raja where the people have been described as they are dark like the sea of journey, a form of doubt, but their bodies are not as smooth as it seems. The stature doesn't exceed 3 feet, their hairs are lifted straight, they have narrow naked foreheads, few of them wear garments made of leaves and use them as low garments. Few of them hang human skulls as necklaces. It is these kind of narratives that we find, and we see that where the traders like Van Leeuwen's argument about peddlers colonizing the Southeast Asia, we find an exact echo in this only for.
Sir, would you mind to speed up? Please.
Hello?
Yes, sir. We are running out of time. Would you mind to please speed up and?
I'll finish up in 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
I'll finish. So therefore, this narrative became successful because there are references to maritime voyages of Odisha in medieval literature, folklore, cultural practices. For example, I have talked about these cultural festivals, but just one, I'll look at this, and why am I suggesting that apart from no reference to maritime voyage, we have also, while sailing the plantain boat, we uttered certain ritual utterances, Akama Vai, Panagua Thui, Panagua Toro, Masakadaram Mor, these kind of utterance while sailing the plantain boat, which is called as Boitavandana by Ghanasamdas, and today it is said so. But actually, if you look at, if it goes back to the origin of these kind of utterance, it appears in the context of obsequious rituals. The first utterance occurs in the Adi Parva of Sarada Mahabharata in 15th century, where Kunti Bhoj, the father of Kunti, went to Ganga to perform certain rituals, religious rituals, and as part of that he is uttering this. Today, the same utterance, Akama Vai, refers to in our nationalist narrative as part of sailing seasons, of going in with the returning monsoon in Kartik Margasir and coming back with southwest monsoon. So these kind of novel deployment strategies led to popularity and lingering of these traditions, or mainstreaming of these traditions. Also, Purnachandra Vasakos, quoting from Matsya Purana, says that also uses Akama Bai as a religious word, a singular word rather than Akama Bai, 4 letters. So these are the, as you could look at the photographs, these are the plantain boating boats which sail on the Kartik Purnima. As I told you, there are several convergences which take place. One is because this is considered to be the time of culmination of Krishna and Radha's Rasalila. We have Akasdipa tradition, which is, Akasdipa is considered to be lighthouse in the nationalist discourse, but it is again a ritual associated with passages of soul from darkness to light, and therefore in my argument, with boat being a cultural symbol of passage, this was used by the existing narrative to have a discourse which is so popular. Today it is considered to be a state festival, as I told you, and there are several deployment strategies like souvenir, Pattachitras, filmy work representing this Boitavandana and the selling of ships, and there are several advantages or functions with this narrative obviously fulfill, and there are several deployment tools such as serving the purpose of history, ritualizations through sailing, through sending voice to Bali has been done by late Vijayapatnaik, and we have institutionalizations like paintings and other things being here. And then we have today, in the age of capitalism, Bali Yatra is touted as the biggest Asian fair, and today it vies with UNESCO's World Intangible Heritage Tag. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Misra, for the presentation. For the sake of time,
I am done.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Misra, for the presentation. For the sake of time, I think we shall, for the time being, move to the next presentation, and afterwards we shall come back for the discussion later. It's better. Now, Dr. Dinya Patel, please take your seat, and I invite Dr. Dinya Patel to make his presentation. The title of his presentation is Our Own Religion in Ancient Persia, the Otherwise Knowledge and the Orientalist Scholarship on Zoroastrianism.
Thank you very much for having me at this event. I'd like to thank in particular KCHR, SSUS, and Manu for inviting me here. It's really great to be in this institution and to meet all of you and to, of course, eat lots of good food. But the topic I want to address today is related to the theme of this course, the theme of this particular seminar in a few ways. I'll primarily be addressing this topic of this body of knowledge known as Orientalism, right? And I'm sure for the students in the audience, many of you have read Edward Said's Orientalism. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And of course, one of the main arguments made in Edward Said's Orientalism is that this body of Orientalist knowledge that was created from, say, the 18th century onward, really flourished in the 19th century by European savants and scholars and such, was done in a very patronizing way towards the quote-unquote Oriental suburb, right? The Asians, Africans, what have you. And since the publication of Said's work, there's been, of course, a lot of criticism, right, of Said's work and also Saidian scholarship. The main line of criticism has been that, the subjects in Oriental scholarship were not passive, right? If you read most Saidian scholarship, you get a certain power dynamic that was not really what actually played out oftentimes on the ground. So the argument that I'm presenting to you today is not original in that sense. Many other scholars have made this argument that Said's conception and Saidian conceptions on this ground at least can be quite flawed. But I want to provide a different perspective, and that is one from Zoroastrianism, and one that was often channeled through political currents. We've had scholarly work on, say, the role of pundits in the creation of Orientalist knowledge in places like Bengal. We've certainly had some scholarship on how knowledge of Islam was created through interaction with Islamic scholars and European savants. Zoroastrianism provides a bit of a different perspective in the sense that first of all, it's a very small religion, right? I'm a Zoroastrian, I'm one of perhaps 100,000 in the world who survived. There was a very small presence at one point in time in Kozhikode, and Aleppo and such, not really much anymore. But this was also a very rich community. And since it was a very rich community, it had access to networks of wealth, power, influence that were international from a very early age. Parsis were interacting with British colonial officials, as early as the 1700s. William Jones, when he was in Calcutta, probably had, as one of his friends, a Parsi living in Calcutta. So this is a community which has a very established and long record of interaction, not just with Europeans, but with Europeans who were involved in the creation of Oriental scholarship, right from the get-go, right from the time of William Jones. So therefore, appropriately, we'll begin our journey with a cemetery in London. In 1862, a group of Parsis in Great Britain purchased a plot, a cemetery plot, outside of London, a place called Brookwood Cemetery. You can still go there today. It's a very large cemetery that was created when London was going through a process of urban change where cemeteries were moved out of the city and into the suburbs. And the Parsis, since there was a group of about maybe 50 or 60 at the time, decided to establish their own cemetery there. In good time. The first Parsi who passed away was just right after this cemetery was purchased. And in this cemetery, you see a process of cultural change that's going on within the community at large. The first gravestones in this community are rather simple affairs. And they are these. which were written in Gujarati and English, and oftentimes referred to the individual who was deceased as a Parsi or Zoroastrian, right? By the late 20th century, you have a very, very different type of representation of who a Parsi is. And you can see the large structure in the back, and that's basically what I'm talking about. That was a structure, a tomb that was built for a man called Nauroji Nashrawanji Wadia. I'm not exactly sure who he was, but he came from a very wealthy shipbuilding family in Bombay. And he modeled that tomb specifically on an ancient tomb in Iran, Pasargade, the tomb of Cyrus. If you Google a picture of that, you'll see resemblances of it. On the side of the tomb are two Achaemenian-style warriors, warriors from the Achaemenid Empire, the empire that was defeated by Alexander the Great around 400 BC. And furthermore, you have the following words engraved on the top of this tomb. I am Nauroji Nashrawanji Wadia, of the ancient Aryan race of Persia. And so here you see again a major cultural change that's going on in a distant corner of London, right? Far away from where the Parsi community is, and in a cemetery. So, as I said, this stands in for something much bigger. Through the late 19th century, the Parsis underwent a deliberate reconstruction of their identity along ancient Iranian lines. If you look at fire temples, our holy places, the earliest fire temples that survive are built in the same style that old masjids or Hindu temples were built, right? I mean, similar to the styles of temples and maybe old churches here. You have your steep-roofed, tiled structure and such. But by the late 19th century, you start to see ancient Persian architecture being deployed in these temples, which otherwise looked like any other temple, patronized by a Hindu or Muslim in a place like Gujarat or Bombay. You start to see the adoption of certain names drawn from ancient Persia. The joke is that if I'm talking to a group of Parsis and I ask where is Cyrus, and half of you will stand up, names like that, Cyrus, Darius, are brought back into the community. Community names become less Gujarati. There were a lot of names that were in common with Hindus and Muslims at the time. And Dadabhai Nauroji, the subject of my talk, was a part of this process of change. He was one of the individuals who helped purchase this plot. And he was also one of the preeminent interlocutors between the Parsi community and European scholars in the late 19th century. So before I get into that, I want to get into who I'm talking about. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard the name Dadabhai Nauroji. He was the subject of my first book, a major nationalist figure in the era before Gandhi, when we usually talk about a phase known as moderate or constitutional nationalism. And for the purposes of refreshing everyone's memory, I'll give a very brief overview of who Nauroji was and tie it to the themes of today's seminar, specifically print and to a lesser degree tradition. So he emerged as a part of a generation of reformers in Bombay known as Young Bombay. Some of you have heard of Young Bengal, no doubt. In the 19th century, there were a lot of youngs. Young Italy, Young Ireland, Young England, Young Bombay, Young Madras to a certain degree, and of course Young Bombay. And these, in Bombay at least, were a group of mostly Hindus and Parsis who had been educated in Elphinstone College, which was the premier educational institute in Western India from the 1840s until the 1850s, who embraced a certain package of reforms. And those reforms included social reform, religious reform, and to a certain degree political reform. These individuals placed a great emphasis on rationality when it came to religion. So unlike their Bengali compatriots in Young Bengal, they were not, fired with the zeal of political radicalism. They were much more kind of pragmatically oriented. They oftentimes excelled in mathematics and statistics, which is why there was a long tradition in Western India of economic scholarship, of which Nauroji was an important part of that dynamic. And of course, these individuals made great use of print. They published newspapers in multiple languages, Gujarati, Marathi, English, oftentimes all in the same, in one particular title. They published lectures, they held seminars, and the newspapers and journals that they created were meant to have a very strong public reach. Many of them were either distributed for free or at very nominal cost in order to make sure that their ideas reached a very large public. And one of the topics that was being discussed in these newspapers were, again, ideas of religious change, new historical literature coming from Europe, philological literature, stuff like that. From the 1860s onward, Nauroji takes part in a larger conversation amongst Indian political leaders. I don't think we can really call them nationalists in the modern sense of the word as yet, but a group of individuals who are oriented towards, political goals. And the primary motivation of this movement at this, early era is the idea of Indian poverty, right? The reality that India was an extremely poor country, and the idea that that poverty was related to British rule. Now, Nauroji once again uses print in order to disseminate these ideas. He publishes a series of lectures. Many of these lectures are actually held in London, but he publishes them and they're distributed across India. And by the very end of the 19th century, they're being translated into Hindi, they're being translated into Gujarati. They're being circulated as far away as the United States, places like Malta, and eventually to places like Indonesia or West Africa when you get to the 20th century and such. So here, again, you have a pretty spectacular demonstration of the spread of print. And of course, by 1885, he's involved in channeling these ideas of colonial drain, poverty of India, and the need to somehow reverse this impoverishment into an explicit political goal. And that goal is some form of Indian autonomy in the political sphere, not yet self-rule or self-government. I mean, in private everyone was thinking of that, but it wasn't publicly enunciated as yet. And the Congress is established in 1885. Now, Nauroji is part of making the Congress a transnational organization. The Congress met in various cities in India, but it also had an office in London, right across the street from the Parliament. So if you're in London today and there's a large house called Portcullis House, where a lot of MPs have their office, he had an office right there. The Congress had an office right there as well. And the Congress published a newspaper called India that was, again, transnational. It was edited by people in both Bombay and London. It was published in both places and distributed in both places. And it's difficult enough today to run a transnational publication. Imagine doing this in the late 1800s when it would take 2 or 3 weeks still, in some cases, to get communication going back and forth between a place like London and Bombay. So here again, print was a very important part of the emerging Indian nationalist project. He becomes a member of Parliament in Great Britain in 1892. He waged 3 different parliamentary campaigns. He won one of them. And here again, while he served in Parliament, print was a very important part of his project, not just amongst his constituents in London, but his goal was to somehow get ideas of Indian reform into the discussion of parliamentary affairs, and one way to do that was to get extracts from Indian newspapers sent to London, sent to Parliament, in order to get MPs familiar with India, because most MPs, when discussion of India became before Parliament, went for tea or lunch. They didn't stay around, and he wanted to reverse that process. And of course, one of the last things Nauroji is known of in his life is declaring that Swaraj, or self-government, should be the goal of the Congress. And here again, the dissemination of print was very important in popularizing this idea. I mean, first of all, Swaraj was not an idea he came up with. It was popularized in Maharashtra as early as potentially even the late 1840s through people like Lokitwadi. If you look in the 1880s and 1890s, people like Tilak are using the term Swaraj. And after Nauroji makes this declaration of Swaraj in 1906, that word filters around the world. In the United States, W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American sociologist and intellectual, picks up this idea. And he actually writes about it in a journal that he publishes in the United States in early 1907. He says, this gives us inspiration as fellow colored people in a different part of the world. So again, pretty spectacular international dimensions to how print is working in the wider international project of Indian nationalism. Now, getting back to our topic. Nauroji, as I mentioned, did all these political activities, but the other thing that many people do not know about Nauroji is that he was also involved in the world of scholarship. This is probably the least known aspect of his life, and I spent about 2 years going through Nauroji's papers in Delhi, and ultimately I wrote a paper on this particular topic that's not a part of my book, because it's such a different aspect of his life. But the one thing I want to emphasize is that even though he functioned as a scholarly figure, his scholarly and political lives were very much intertwined. In many ways, the scholars that he met also had a foot in the game of politics. And a great example is the scholar Max Muller. Again, someone who perhaps amongst your students you might be familiar with. Max Muller was, of course, a well-known scholar based in Oxford, but he was also involved in Indian political movements. And so therefore probably got to know Nauroji at a very young age. Through the world of scholarship, political connections were made and vice versa as well. Now, Nauroji did much more than actually just communicate with European scholars. He actually actively promoted the dissemination of their scholarship and influenced the direction of some of their scholarship as well. He evolved into the position of an interlocutor between Orientalists in Europe and members of the Parsi community in Bombay, as well as, you could argue, a wider scholarly circle in places like Bombay as well. And again, this position that Nauroji occupied shows a very different story from, say, what's portrayed in Scientific literature. This image that you see over here is in relation to an association that Nauroji founded with Max Muller in order to specifically disseminate the latest scholarship on ancient Iran, ancient India, ancient civilizations in this part of the world to a general public, not just in Europe, but also in India. It unfortunately went defunct very quickly, but here is a pretty spectacular partnership that's taking place between scholars and the subjects of that scholarly study as well. Now, as I mentioned, Nauroji in his earlier life, had participated in this thing called Young Bombay, where newspapers were an important part of disseminating new ideas. One of these newspapers was called Rasta Guftar, a Gujarati and English language publication started in 1851, which survived actually until the 20th century. And in here, Nauroji expressed many of the reformist positions that were being discussed within the Zoroastrian community. Zoroastrianism was going through a period of reform whereby certain ideas and beliefs were being thought of as being authentic and inauthentic. And there was a tremendous influence over here of the role of missionaries. If you read Manu Pillai's latest work, he talks a lot about the role of missionaries in influencing modern Hinduism. And in Zoroastrianism, missionaries played a very important role as well, because missionaries were trying to pass off Zoroastrianism as this sort of eclectic faith where people were worshipping nature and fire, non-monotheistic, and Parsis reacted by saying, no, this is actually incorrect, and let us actually go back into our texts, reinterpret them, rely on the most recent scholarship in order to defend the particular ideas that we have about our religion. This took on a slightly different turn after 1855, when Nauroji actually leaves Bombay and goes to London in order to work in a business house in London. From 1856 onward, Nauroji actually joined the staff of University College London as a Gujarati instructor. So here he's becoming a part of larger scholarly networks, and he's not the only Parsi who's being involved in these networks. One of his colleagues was a man called K.R. Kama, who went to Paris and Erlangen in Germany in order to study Zoroastrianism with some of the leading scholars of that time, people like Julius von Mohl. Now, in 1861, Nauroji actually delivered 2 scholarly papers in the city of Liverpool before scholarly organizations on the Parsi community. And his goal in these talks was to describe, first of all, Zoroastrianism to an unfamiliar audience, audience of Britons, and to defend the reformist program, to talk about what Parsis were doing differently in order to kind of modernize and reform the religion along rationalist lines. And so one element of his talk was to discuss the latest attempts at countering countering orthodox habits and customs that were deemed inauthentic. But the other goal of these 2 talks was to also describe to an audience what Zoroastrianism basically was. And so Nauroji described it as a monotheistic faith, a faith that was quite simple, a faith that believed in only one God, the creator of all people. These are his actual words. He specifically disputed the idea that Parsis were fire worshippers. He oftentimes used his own methods in order to defend his position. So in order to counter the idea that Zoroastrians were not fire worshippers, he came up with an ingenious explanation for why fire was worshipped, whereas other elements like water or air were not worshipped in the same way. I mean, this is him using his own particular methods and readings of texts in order to understand how the religion evolved. Now, these talks, again, published in 1861, had international circulation. They were being discussed in places as far away as the United States, and they had a long life. People like Helena Blavatsky, one of the founders of Theosophy, included excerpts from this talk in her first major work, Isis Unveiled. These talks also revealed that Nauroji was in correspondence with, again, some of the leading Orientalists of the day. People like Martin Hogue, Frederick Spiegel, James Thomas Voltaire, and Charles Joseph Harless. All individuals who were important not just in the study of Zoroastrianism or Hinduism, but in the creation of the tenets of modern religious studies in general. But the most interesting response to these talks came from Max Muller. And Muller at this time was a young don at Oxford University. He had probably known Nauroji because both of them were involved in administering civil service examinations in Indian languages. And in 1862, Muller publishes a two-part review of these talks. And largely praises Nauroji's perspectives. He finds many things wrong in his talks, at least in his opinion, but he uses Nauroji's talk to make a larger argument, which is that in order for the Parsi community to continue down this road of reform, it had to embrace the latest European Orientalist scholarship coming out of universities in places like France and Great Britain, etc. So in other words, he was encouraging Parsis to kind of patronize European philological scholarship, and that's indeed what happened later on. Nauroji's next scholarly intervention took place in 1866 in a place called the London Ethnological Society. And here, Nauroji was responding to a talk that was given by the president of this organization, a man called John Crawford. Crawford was a terribly racist individual. And somewhat before 1866, when Nauroji gave this talk, Crawford gave a talk called On the Differences Between the Races of Man, where he basically says Europeans are great, they're taller, they stand erect, they do better in certain climates. Europeans, Asians in comparison, always sit down, they're passive, their civilizational accomplishments are basically nil. So even by the standards of Victorian Britain, this is a terribly racist piece of scholarship, if I can even call it that. And Nauroji took upon the task of rebutting Crawford in his own organization. Crawford was the leader of this organization, and for about 2 hours he gave this really, really long speech that kept everyone awake until like 10 o'clock at night, during one evening. And he relied again here on European philological scholarship and history and work on ancient cultures to rebut all of the points that Crawford made. So, for example, when Crawford said Asians had, made no real contributions to world religion, he pointed out, no, technically, actually, Jesus is actually an Asian. What are you talking about, crazy man? So forth and so on. Turning to India specifically, he cited from people like William Jones, Max Muller, other people like Theodore Goldstrucker, who was an Indologist and student of Sanskrit. Nauroji also specifically made use of correspondence that he carried on with some of the leading scholars of the day. So he actually cited letters that he had exchanged with professors like Julius Monvol, Friedrich Spiegel, in order to put together this paper. So here you have Orientalist scholarship being used by an Indian for a specific political purpose, rebutting racist arguments. Right? So, as I mentioned, Nauroji was not the only person doing this at the time. One of his friends and colleagues was a man called K.R. Kama, who had studied in Germany and France and went back to Bombay, where he had a long scholarly career. There's still an institute named after him in Kalagoda today. And both Nauroji, K.R. Kama, and a few other individuals who were in this world of both scholarship, reform, and kind of an international Parsi diaspora put together and discussed a large reformist package for Zoroastrianism. So they discussed ways to simplify rituals, they discussed which works of scholarship from Europe should be translated, and over time, Parsis in India came to recognize these people as important interlocutors. So if they wanted patronage for the works that they published, if they wanted certain items that they published in Gujarati to be translated into English, they contacted these people in order to get them to help. And likewise, European scholars were looking at people like Nauroji and K.R. Kama as interlocutors in the other direction. So after Nauroji was elected to the British Parliament in 1892, he got a note of congratulation from Max Muller. But Max Muller also added a line there saying, can you please help me get membership to the new Imperial Institute in London, which was this very big new museum that was being established in the city. And the way that he wanted to do that was to get the Parsis of Bombay to actually nominate him as a member. So here you have a very strong two-way relationship being established between European scholars and the Parsis. And the person who best represented this dynamic was a man called Lawrence H. Mills. I doubt any of you have heard of this man, but he was one of the contributors to the series called The Sacred Books of the East. He was responsible for the volume on Zoroastrianism, so he published translations of the Zandavasta. He was born in the United States. He eventually moves to Great Britain and goes to Oxford, where he holds a non-tenured position, a familiar position for some of us in academia today. And he relied on Nauroji for many things. From 1888 onward, Nauroji and Mills entered into a very long correspondence, and that correspondence survives today in Nauroji's archival collections. And the first things that Mills asked for were quite prosaic things: money. So he knew that Parsis were wealthy. He was publishing all this stuff, oftentimes self-publishing, and so he asked for Parsis to financially support his scholarship. And many of the Parsis actually did this. There was a subscription list that was sent around in Bombay. The Bombay Parsi Panchayat, which is our community's apex body, also helped raise money for these particular publications. And at the same time, people like Nauroji were saying, these are our own scholars in the Zoroastrian community, let me show you their works. So he sent translations of Gujarati texts that scholars in Bombay were using to this man in Oxford. And as a result of this very warm reception, Mills, throughout the 1880s and 1890s, kept on peppering Nauroji with numerous requests. So whenever he came out with a new publication, he would write to Nauroji and said, could you please write a favorable review in something like the Times of London? By 1897, Mills was getting tired of the fact that he didn't have a secure tenured position, as many people in that position would be, and so he asked Zoroastrians to help him get an actual chair in Oxford. He asked if the Zoroastrian Association in London, the Zoroastrian Fund, the same organization which purchased that cemetery plot I showed you, could endow a particular chair over there. When he heard that one very wealthy Parsi philanthropist in Bombay had died, a woman, a lady called Bai Motli Bai Wadia, he immediately wrote to Nauroji and said, can you ask her heir for money? Can you get money from this particular individual? And in response, if that particular heir endowed a chair, he would make sure to take on several Parsi students in Oxford. Okay, so there's a very clear two-way street, again, that's continuing over here. Now, we'd be wrong to see this relationship as being entirely based upon patronage. If you look at the tone of the letters, if you look at the larger pattern of friendship we see between Nauroji and Mills, you see that there's a very strong sign of cordiality, of mutual support, mutual respect between the parties. Mills was an enthusiastic supporter of disseminating Orientalist scholarship to Zoroastrians, and actually asked in 1888 if there were enough Parsis in London so that he could hold a special class for Parsi students to kind of educate them on the latest scholarship that's coming out. So there's a very strong bond of friendship that's built in between scholars and the Parsi community, which really continues throughout the 20th century. I mean, you see very, very close bonds being built between the Parsi community in Bombay and certain centers like SSUS or Oxford or the University of Paris to a certain degree. Now, I'll end by talking about Nauroji's last talk, which takes place in 1888 in a place called the South Place Institute, a very prominent Universalist association. And in 1888, the South Place Institute invited both Nauroji and Mills to deliver talks, which were later published in a series called The Religious Systems of the World. And Nauroji's talk, delivered in 1888, was different from his earlier talks in the sense that he imbibed the scholarship, in particular, of a man called Martin Hoag. Martin Hoag was a German philologist, and he argued that the historical Zarathustra actually reformed the religion, much like, say, Jesus reformed Judaism into something like Christianity, or much like, say, Martin Luther reformed what we now call Catholicism into Protestant Zoroastrianism. So if you look at the talk that Nauroji gave him, he's basically repeating many of the arguments that Hoag is making. So here again we see that Nauroji is pretty much on the cusp of the latest type of scholarship going on. This particular talk solidified Nauroji's reputation as being an internationally renowned scholar. His talk was delivered again in Switzerland, in absentia, by someone else who decided that this talk was important enough to be translated into French and disseminated to Swiss Indologists and Iranologists as well. So that by 1892, so just a few years after this talk was given, when a group of people in Chicago decide to hold something called the world's first parliament of religions along the lines of, alongside the world's Columbian exhibition, when they think of who to invite to this conference, they think of a few people from India, right? One is, of course, Swami Vivekananda, right? The other person they think of is Dadabhai Naoroji. So they write to him and they ask Naoroji, can you attend? And Naoroji says, sorry, I can't. I've just been elected to the British Parliament. I have my hands tied over here. Now, when he writes that letter, the people in Chicago are actually very unsatisfied and say, no, we really want you to come. You're quite well known in America. An American scholar in particular recommended you. You really need to come here. Naoroji says no. They write back again saying, pretty please, you come across. Chicago's a great place. But eventually, Naoroji, of course, says he can't do it, but he is still invited to be a member of the committee that is organizing this particular event. So I'll end on that note. The possibility that alongside Swami Vivekananda in Chicago, in this great seminal moment in discussion of Hinduism in the West, you might also have had Dadabhai Naoroji talking about Zoroastrianism. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dinya. Now, both the papers are now open for discussion. Dr. Dinya, I would like to raise one. Okay. See, when this British Orientalism was taking place, there was simultaneously another part of the British discovery of Persia within India that was going on. Kind of personalization, further personalization was going on. Was Dadabhai Naoroji influenced by it?
So you're talking about British archaeological work in Iran? Hard to tell. I've not found any evidence. That might be a little bit later. In the early 20th century, Dorabji Tata, I think, sponsored archaeological work in Patna that was trying to establish some tenuous link between, the Achaemenid Empire and the Mauryan Empire. So later on, that's there.
Oh. And again, when Naoroji was in England, at the time the British Museum was already full of Persian materials.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, London was a good place in order to, in order to study about ancient Persia and also to meet many other intellectuals, right? I mean, when Naoroji was going to the British Museum, or the British Library, as we know it today, other people in the reading room included people like Max Muller, also included people like Karl Marx, who Naoroji might have met when he was in London as well.
But one more thing, just the Islamic Persia was also existing within India. Was Naoroji influenced?
So
that was also part of the ongoing Orientalist discourses.
I mean, Zoroastrianism, practiced Zoroastrianism up until the mid-19th century was heavily influenced by Islam and by a certain Perso-Indic Islamic culture. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at translations, of religious texts, they have a very Islamic formulation to them. If you go to fire temples, certain customs clearly have some sort of Islamic imprint. So there is that, but the reformist generation that Naoroji was a part of actually tried to get rid of a lot of that. As well as certain customs that they deemed being Hindu rather than quote-unquote authentically Zoroastrian.
Can I ask a just a follow-up question very quickly to that exchange. I mean, how might have been the sort of that shift to, tracing the antecedents to Hindu sort of traditions been articulated? I mean, how was it argued that the shift? I'm very curious.
You're talking in particular to say like Hindu culture and such, right? Or
Yeah, you just mentioned how the links between Zoroastrianism and Persian Islamic Persian culture
yeah,
was sort of downplayed,
yeah, yeah.
and instead the possible sort of proximity or the affinity with Hindu. No. Is that what you were saying? Did I get
Kind
right?
of different, yeah. I mean, essentially, Zoroastrianism goes through a process of Protestantization, right? In the mid-19th century, where reformers like Nauroji look at the religion and say, this is authentic, this is not authentic. We borrow this from Hinduism. This is authentic, this is not authentic. We borrow this from Islam. And so the religion that they kind of rely upon is thought to be free of these particular influences. Now we know in reality that the actual story is much more complex. But you see, as early as the 1830s, if you have the courage to go to the Maharashtra State Archives and inhale dust and look at their own newspapers from the 1830s, and my God, what an experience, you will see that as early as the 1830s, there are people who are saying these customs are wrong. Why are Zoroastrians going to the shrines of Muslim saints? Why are they practicing quote-unquote black magic? That seems to be borrowed from particular local Marathi Hindu or Gujarati Hindu customs. And so these were regarded as being inauthentic and therefore they need to be gotten rid of. So as early as the 1830s this is being discussed. I mean, you can definitely make an argument that yes, missionary polemics played a role in kind of coaxing reformist sentiments in both Hinduism and Zoroastrianism, but you see this really early on in Zoroastrianism, which tends to kind of point to the fact that Zoroastrians themselves were talking about reform even before it's shoved down their throats by missionaries.
Does it have anything to do with the national context of the nation being imagined as Hindu?
Less so. In Bombay, Bombay was, I don't want to use the word tolerant, but I mean, the political culture of Bombay was just so much more multicultural that the Parsis felt very comfortable in their own skins. And I think that dynamic really kicks in much later, say in the 1930s. After the experience of communal riots in a place like Bombay, that Parsis realized, oh, we're in a minority. Muslims are talking about their own nation, what happens to smaller minorities like us? I mean, many other communities had that same dialogue, right, from the 1930s onward. In this era, it's very different. Parsis are very self-assured, perhaps too self-assured, one could argue. So they don't worry about that. I mean, it really is, in this sense, a cultural transformation based on the idea that ancient Iran was a great civilization on par with, say, Rome or Greece, and therefore that makes us look better in the eyes of Europeans. Let's kind of re-inculcate those links.
Thank you, Dinya. That was really fascinating. If I can take you back to the beginning of your talk, when you showed that picture from the cemetery, and I thought it was building towards telling us a little more about how the word race, or race as a part of Parsi self-image, begins to take place. Is it possible for us? Is it possible to track that term race in Parsi self-image and see, for instance, were there words from community used earlier, Jamaat kehta hai, and then people were using race, because there is clearly a shift, and it's a pretty strong sort of a part of being a Parsi, right? To think of racial purity and so forth. So if that has a certain historical moment, that self-image, it would be good to know a little more about it.
Yeah, I mean, earlier on in the Gujarati sources, you do see terms like Kon, for example, being used. But as early as the 1830s again, there is discussion of different nationalities. The word nationality used in the English press, and now in the Gujarati press, it's a little bit different. But by the 1850s, enough Parsis are writing in English, and they're referring to race specifically. So you see that shift happening around there, which is around the time when you see a broader discussion, right? I mean, it's maybe a little too early for social Darwinistic ideas, but that idea develops after social Darwinism kind of comes to the fore in Europe. So that by the late 19th century, there's an idea of a Parsi nation. Now, of course, not territorially linked, but a group of people There is, links with ancient Persia and the ancient Persian nation that are really put into play. The idea of a distinct, quote-unquote, pure race is being discussed all over the place. And of course, very problematic, right? I mean, just look at any of us and we look very Gujarati, So that really is a product of, it's very different from what Naroji is taking part in. I mean, Naroji is largely in London. He's not as closely linked in these parts of the arguments, and he actually is repulsed by many Parsis who are saying, "Oh, we are somehow different. We are really ancient Persians." He says, "No, that's us. I mean, we are actually Indian as well as everyone else, and all of the people saying that we're not really Indian." So he is one of the people who takes a position of criticism in that movement. But there are many others. I mean, if you want a pretty early example of that, this is a man called Dusabai Ramji Karaka, who wrote a description of the Parsis in 1858, right after 1857, to say, hey, we're okay, don't blame us. And then it was translated into English, and he infused the ideas of Parsi distinctness in that particular piece. So as early as, say, the 1860s, he's articulating an idea of the Parsi community where ideas of racial purity, difference.
This is the D.F. Karaka thingy.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks a lot for that energetic and enthusiastic lecture. Thanks a lot. My question is also not about Dadabhai Naoroji per se. Even I am taking you back to that first slide of that cemetery, because I am currently working on cemetery and burial culture, so I am personally interested in that.
Yeah.
So it was in England, you said, and what was the negotiation made by the Parsi community or the leadership there with the UK state and the co-participants or the Parsis, because burial is not a usual custom among Parsis. It's the Tower of Silence. So how is that negotiation taking place both with the state authority and with other Parsis?
Yeah. So in answer to your first question, Brookwood, this complex called Brookwood, which is this large cemetery that's developed from the 1850s onward, was open to anyone. So I mean, there is in that area, next to the Parsi cemetery, there's a Muslim cemetery, which dates from around the same era. In fact, I think the second oldest mosque in Great Britain is there, Woking. So it's not just Parsis who are taking part. So it's since London was such a cosmopolitan international center, by 1850, this cemetery would have included many different denominations within Christianity, and also many different other, religious faiths. I'm sure there was a large Jewish cemetery there as well. So that's in relation to the first question. The second question is in relation to burial custom, and that's a longer debate. So traditionally, Parsis, or all Zoroastrians, I should say, really up until the, those in Iran as well, would have, left their dead to, kind of be eaten by vultures, right, in a tower of silence. Now, this becomes a problem when Parsis start going out of Bombay and Gujarat, right? So when they move to a place like Calcutta, they say, what do we do? And eventually they decide to build a Tower of Silence there. So if you go to Calcutta, there is actually a Tower of Silence there. But when they go further afield to a place like Rangoon, Kobe, Canton, Mombasa, they don't feel as comfortable doing that. And so there they rely on burial. I'm not exactly sure how it was justified at the very start. But by the 19th century, the argument, I mean, what you see everywhere is that wherever we're in a place where we cannot have recourse to the Towers of Silence, burial is the next best option. So, to give you a good example of that, many years ago I was in the National Archives of Great Britain in Kew, and I came across a file related to Parsis in Beijing. And what were they discussing? They were discussing opening a cemetery in Beijing in the early 20th century. Because these were one of these new community outposts where, you couldn't have a fire temple, so the next best thing was burial. In Iran, a similar dynamic is present, where, by the 1920s, as there's an ethos of kind of modernization in Iran under the Pahlavis, the community actually deliberately breaks with past practice of using the Towers of Silence, and everyone is buried. So in Iran to this day, everyone is buried. The Parsis in Bombay kind of still cling to that tradition, but Iran made that shift.
I've actually read that there was few Parsi families in Calicut,
Yeah.
and they were also relying on burial.
Yeah. Calicut, Alapi, in fact there's... yeah, a few, but Alapi and Kozhikode were the two big centers. In fact, we have a last name, Alpaiwala, which comes from Alapi. So, our big museum in Bombay is called the Alpaiwala Museum. We have a link with here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
See, Dr. Umakant is also awaiting our response to his presentation.
More suggestion rather than questions.
Dr. Mishra, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to just sort of draw you out a little more on that. This is Veena Naregal from Delhi, and I want to sort of draw you out a little bit on that, on the reference you made to the 1940 moment where you found
37 to 39.
37 to 39, when the first mention of the Bali Yatra is made in the History Congress. Is that what, or the National Congress?
Yes, 1940 proceeding.
Of the INC, right?
No, proceeding of Indian History Congress.
Indian History Congress, okay. I mean, that's also sort of very close to the point when Orissa actually becomes a linguistic, is finally being, sort of recognized as a linguistic province, right? 1935, is that 36, right? So, and you were making certain comments about how this was also the time when there is sort of dissatisfaction amongst tribal populations, and the articulation of a sort of homogeneous linguistic identity is becoming more and more difficult, the 1940 moment. Now, of course, this is sort of so interesting what you're saying, because perhaps less important than the controversy over who invented the Rasgulla. Odisha, the sort of claim about, where linguistic mobilization actually happened before. Was it, as a response to the Bengal partition, or was it actually the 1890s in Odisha? Right? If linguistic mobilization actually happened in Odisha, that sort of early on, this 1940 moment that you're tracing sort of was of great interest to me. And why is there, a lack of sort of trust in the articulation of linguistic identity, Odia or linguistic identity, so close to the time after it actually becomes a linguistic province?
I explained two reasons. One, in the narrative of linguistic homogeneous identity, you have to add speaking people, Dravidian speaking people, and that becomes problematic in defining Odisha, not as a homogeneous community of Odia speaking, because you have lot of Adivasis are now being included. The second part, which is more important, those who are the protagonists of linguistic merger of different administrative provinces of British Odisha, they became the principal foe of it between 1937-39 in view of the Prajavandar movement, which is about movements of the people in tributary states or Gurjat states. These Rajas who played a vital role in patronizing Odia literature, in creating linguistic identity, participating in round table talks like Mayurbhanj Raja, they were the last one to be part of Odisha during merger time. Why? Because they were not ready to set their own political entities. Therefore, the issue of homogeneous linguistic identity became problematic. Also the class contradictions came to fore during the, as I explained during the anti-Jamindari. These are the two major issues over which Congress ministry resigned in 1939. Participation in Second World War was merely an euphemism. The real cause for the contradictions, many contradictions in the discourse of a homogeneous, national self, including the class differences. And therefore, you need to, that seems to be a linear, recursive entry of the so-called glorious past, even though we are looking forward to a bright future. That continues even in post-colonial time, post-independence time. Maybe because of the so-called, internalizations of immiserizations of the community, as I told you, in the writing of the colonial writing. I quoted from Sterling's 1822, Hunter's 1872 Orissa. And the kind of narrative also we find in Bengali works. The immiserizations, the backwardness of a community, of a region. That could be possible reason why there is a recursive re-entry of the so-called bright past. Even in the time of liberalism, where there are so much resources in the state, mineral and otherwise. Today we have, day before yesterday, we have the 593rd coronations of Kapilendra Gajapati. These are becoming quite common nowadays.
Thank you.
Dr. Umakanda, in the 1930s and 40s, not only Orissa, South India, especially Tamil Nadu, was also claiming the Indonesian heritage for remaking its own past. Was this claims from the South making any discomfort in the Odishan claims?
No, not at all. Because it's not Odisha historian who was making this claim. It was all Bengali historians.
Yes, yes.
Was part of the Bengali society. And he was
very fine. It's a very interesting chapter of Indian nationalist discourse.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed.
See,
He is fluent in Odisha and he works also on Odisha.
see one more question to Dr. Mohammed.
Dr. Mishra, this is Prachi speaking.
Good evening.
Hello. I was, wondering, I think your point about the Bengali investment in Odisha of a particular kind is very well taken. But I'm surprised that R.C. Majumdar, despite all of his emphasis on Greater India, does not figure, has not really addressed this Bali Jatra doesn't figure in his discussion or a kind of maritime history at all, does it? I don't know if I missed that in your presentation, but do you find it surprising that, since he is sort of the doyen of the Greater India thesis, how come he doesn't figure, or has he at least been retroactively included in the scholarly apparatus to bolster the Bali Jatra now, especially with the current political dispensation?
About R.C. Majumdar?
Yeah. Yes.
No, because of R.C. Majumdar's Hindu colonizations and Suvarnadipam, that Bhamisan speaks of the threat, and now proposing Bali Jatra as a voice in 1940.
But he himself has not talked about Bali Jatra, right? Or has he?
Yes.
R.C. Majumdar himself has not at all talked about the Bali Jatra.
How will this become? This is an invented tradition only after 1940s. By that time, you know that 1956 Greater Indian Society journals were stopped. By that time, decolonization has started has come up in a big way, and therefore there is no scope for Greater Indian Society in 1950s, 60s. 1956 is stopped. So therefore, only on the basis of the writing of Greater Indian Society, a historian is picking up the thread and making these connections of Bali Jatra as opposed to. Bali Jatra as a festival has been continuing. But now these new propositions came up only because of the Greater Indian Society articulations as to which Ghanashyam Das, or there are several threads to it, such as cultural festivals, practices, plantain boat sailing, which I told you is more about obsequious rituals for the dead. Therefore, these kind of connections were now being added, and because of the convergence of certain cultural, that makes invented tradition so enduring. Because of the kind of cultural connection it makes with the past, in the making of in an invention traditions, which is a new.
Thank you.
My question is just to Dinyar. Okay, I'm asking to Dinyar. So, Dinyar, thank you for your presentation. And just going back to the beginning of your talk, but not the symmetry. The beginning of your talk, when you said that you sort of posed your history, your enterprise of history, vis-a-vis the Saidian enterprise. And I am interested in knowing if you, or say if you can comment a little more on the kind of conceptual work that your kind of history is meant to do. Because when you look at sort of Saidian history, you can always sort of find figures as Dadabhai Naoroji, who would stand out of systems of representation. Because Said's focus, or people who write in the same tradition, they are not really looking at individuals, rather discourses. So, in terms of method, in terms of conceptual contribution, if you can comment a little more on writing on such figures vis-a-vis, since you deliberately sort of pitched your presentation vis-a-vis a certain Saidian way of writing history. So where is your sort of point of departure and what take you have on that? Because obviously Saidian enterprise will also entail very complex representation. So you have not just that that the agents were passive.
Yeah, obviously it's impossible to distill all of Said's positions to one thing, but I think that's one very common criticism that you face, and my problem is not so much with Said as with many Saidian scholars, right? I think within South Asian studies there has been a lot of this, I mean, whether you see it in parts of subaltern studies or elsewhere, this dynamic that colonial oppressor versus Indian subject, and there is discussion of resistance, but agency is, the lines seem a little too neat, in my opinion. Not very, right? But in my opinion at least, oftentimes it seems a little too neat. And my particular approach is, based very, very strongly on what the archives are saying, right? And I think when you go with empirical history rather than just say like these theoretical frameworks, you discover that a lot of the history that you're dealing with is much more complex and much more messy. And someone like Naoroji in many ways represents this messiness, right? Depending on what era you're looking at, he's actually, he could be talking about why British colonialism is good, but then, at a later date, he's talking about British colonialism being, evil and terrible. And those two dates are actually not too far apart, right? So using theoretical constructs, in my opinion, is a little difficult because the actual historical record shows us something that oftentimes is very jagged and crooked. And a theoretical construct like what you have in much Saidian scholarship sounds nice. If you read a lot of the other stuff I've written, but I try to argue that it sounds nice and it works well, but it does a disservice in many ways to the archive. That I think is a bit problematic.
Dinyar, I was wondering what the Parsis of the 1830s meant by Hinduism.
Yeah.
You know, because Hinduism is something which even 1857 couldn't produce. It comes up only in the 1880s and 90s, particularly with the cow production movement and so on. So what was the referent here when they spoke of the Hindu?
Yeah. So, again, I'm drawing from newspapers that were published at the time. And there actually are references to, say, Hindu festivals, right? Hindu festivals or Muslim shrines. So at least in Bombay in the 1830s, that division is there. If we look a little bit later to say 1851, 1852, there's this organization called the Ranume Mazdayasna Sabha that's founded in Bombay. That is, it's called, translates as the kind of the society towards the true Mazdayasni way. Mazdayasni kind of stands in for Zoroastrianism. And here, there are certain things that are being identified as, I forget the actual Gujarati words that, I could pull it up on my computer, that are wrong or impure and such like that. And there are various things that are mentioned. One over here is definitely patronage of Muslim shrines. But then there are all these other things, black magic, that are not being referred to as Hindu directly, but it's kind of implied. If you understand, there might be a reference to Diwali, or there might be a reference to, one or two other festivals that were quite popular in Bombay. So it's messy depending on which sources you're looking at, right? Certainly by 1833, if you're looking at papers that are published by people like Balagangada Shastri Jambekar, who published Bombay Darpan, a pretty influential paper, he's referring to Hinduism and Hindu construct in a certain way.
The term is pretty current by the turn of the 19th century. At least in Marathi, but definitely in English, from Elphinstone's time, I don't think anybody's agreed on what exactly its content is, and it's probably taking the first thing first kind of expression of it that's in front of them. But the overall category as such is present in Gujarat.
So, for example, Jambekar notices young Bengal, and he says, I'm going to describe to you a group of Hindus who have left Hinduism or have renounced Hinduism. So, and he's referring, of course, to people like Krishna Mohan Banerjee and others. So at least in the metropolitan centers, there's a bit of an idea of what it is. And I think a lot of that, again, is in relation to missionary. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes, we are on time.
Amazing.
Let me invite Uma Nasir, as a scholar of this department, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening all. I feel happy and honored to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of our department as we conclude this session on print and history. My sincere gratitude to Dr. N.J. Francis, chair of the session, for guiding the presentation so effectively. A big thank you to our speakers, Professor Rida Badari, Dr. Kumara Mishra and Dr. Linyar Patel, for sharing their insights and helping us deepen our understanding of history, literature and print culture. We are also thankful to KCHR for organizing this workshop in collaboration with the Department of History, Sree Sankaracharya University of Sanskrit. Finally, thank you to all the teachers, research scholars, organizers and everyone who joined us today. Your support and presence made this event truly special. Thank you all.
Yeah, tomorrow we'll assemble here again at about 10 o'clock in the morning.
I started 9:30.
9:30?
We have to do the registration.
Okay. 9:30 in the morning? Fine.
Then we can do the registration. Okay? Thank you so much. Thank you.